7 years, 12 specialists. Not a single one of them gave Vivian Thorn her voice back. She ran a $2.8 billion healthcare consulting firm from behind a tablet screen, and the world had arranged itself around that fact so completely that no one questioned it anymore. Her typed directives arrived faster than most executives could speak them. Her silence had become, in the eyes of everyone who reported to her, a kind of authority. No one asked why. No one looked for another answer. No one, that is, until the man who had no business having an answer showed up in her office at 7:10 on a Wednesday morning with a tool bag and a work order and eyes that had spent years learning not to miss anything small. His name was Douglas Reeve. He was 48 years old, a father, and the most precise HVAC technician working the commercial corridor between downtown Portland and the coast. He was not a doctor, not anymore, not in any official capacity. But there are certain kinds of knowledge that don't leave a person simply because they've stopped using them. The way a disused language lives in the mouth, even after years of silence. The way the body remembers what the mind has decided to set aside. Douglas arrived at the Thorn Consulting Building the same way he arrived at every job. 7 minutes early. Tools checked the night before. Thermos of black coffee already half empty. His daughter Juniper had been asleep when he left, her arm thrown over the edge of the bed in the particular way she slept. Loose, trusting, unconscious of the world's weight. He had tucked her arm back under the blanket without waking her and stood in her doorway for 4 seconds before going downstairs. 4 seconds, he allowed himself that much. The work order was routine. A primary air handler on the 32nd floor had been flagging irregular pressure readings for 6 days. The building's facilities manager had logged 3 maintenance requests before anyone responded. Douglas had taken the job at the last minute, covering for a colleague. He did not know, when he loaded his van that morning, that he was driving towards something that would reopen the part of himself he had decided to keep closed. The executive floor was the kind of space that cost a great deal of money to look effortless. Pale limestone, low light, the temperature calibrated a degree below comfortable, the specific coldness that communicates consequence without saying so. The facilities coordinator met him at the elevator, handed him an access card, and told him to keep noise to a minimum because the CEO was working. Douglas kept noise to a minimum. He always did. It was one of the reasons his clients liked him, though most of them couldn't have named exactly why. He moved through a space the way a surgeon moves through a procedure, with economy, with attention, with a thorough absence of wasted motion. The primary air handler was housed in a utility corridor adjacent to the executive office. The door between the corridor and the office had been left ajar for airflow. Douglas worked for 18 minutes before he heard anything. When he did, he stopped. Not a voice, not speech. Something smaller than either, a fractional involuntary vibration, the kind that occurs deep in the larynx when the vocal cords are present and intact and attempting, however briefly, to do what they were built to do. He heard it twice. The second time, he set down his torque wrench. He had spent 6 years, before everything changed, working in acoustic biomedical research, specifically in laryngeal function monitoring. He had built instruments that measured the precise mechanical signatures of vocal cord behavior. He had published 3 papers on the difference between structural vocal cord pathology and what the literature carefully called functional dysphonia, a condition where the mechanics were intact and the neurology was intact and the voice was gone anyway, held in place by something no imaging equipment could locate, because it was not physical. It was not damage, it was protection. He recognized the sound the way you recognize a chord you haven't heard in years, but still know every note of. Douglas completed the pressure calibration. He checked his gauges. He logged the repair in his work order tablet. Then he picked up his tool bag, walked to the office door, and knocked twice on the frame. Vivian Thorn looked up. She was a woman of 51, with the composed, upright posture of someone who has learned to let presence do the work that volume cannot. She wore a steel gray blazer and reading glasses she hadn't pushed up from the bridge of her nose. Her tablet sat open beside a legal pad covered in handwritten annotations. She held a stylus in her right hand the way a person holds a pen, when writing is how they have learned to live. She looked at Douglas with the practiced, neutral appraisal of an executive assessing an unfamiliar face in her space. He didn't explain why he was standing there. He looked at her the way he had once looked at signal readouts. Not at the label, not at the category, but at the thing itself. "You made a sound," he said, "twice while I was working. Your chords are trying." He paused. "That doesn't happen with structural damage." The stylus stopped. The silence that followed was not hostile. It was the silence of a person who has heard something so precisely accurate and so entirely outside the available framework for receiving it that the ordinary mechanisms for response simply do not engage. Vivian stared at him for a long moment. Then she reached for her tablet and typed 3 words. She turned the screen toward him. "Who are you?" "Douglas Reeve," he said. "I fixed your air handler." He picked up his tool bag. "Have a good morning." He was back in the elevator before she had finished processing what had just happened. But the words had already landed, and the office, though nothing in it had moved, was no longer the same room it had been 11 minutes ago. Douglas did not think about it on the drive to his next job. He thought about Juniper's science fair project, which was due in 9 days and currently existed only as a list of ideas taped to the refrigerator. He thought about the grocery situation, which required attention by Thursday. He thought about the envelope on the kitchen counter, the one with the return address, from the Pacific Northwest Biomedical Consortium, which he had been not opening for 3 weeks. He picked up Juniper from her after-school program at 4 o'clock. She ran to him the way she always ran, full speed, backpack swinging, shoelaces improbably still tied. She grabbed his hand and told him, without pausing for breath, about a girl in her class who had gotten a hamster, and whether hamsters were lonely animals, and whether a lonely animal could still be happy if it had enough to do, and whether that was the same for people. Douglas considered this seriously, the way she expected him to. "Depends on the person," he said. Juniper thought about it. "What about you?" "I have enough to do," he said. She looked at him for a moment with the particular, measuring quality she had inherited from her mother. A look that said she had heard the answer and noted it and was filing it for later. Then she climbed into the van and asked if they could have waffles for dinner. They had waffles for dinner. Vivian Thorn had not mentioned what the technician said, not to Frances, not to her attorney, not to Bernard Colby when he called at 2 that afternoon to go over the quarterly operational summary. She had continued her day with the efficiency she had built over 7 years into something so finely tuned it no longer required effort. It simply ran like a mechanism calibrated to perpetual motion. But efficiency requires full attention. Her attention was no longer fully available. That evening, alone in her apartment, she sat in front of her bathroom mirror and tried something she had not attempted in years. Not to speak, not a word, not a syllable, just a sound, the smallest possible exhalation with intention behind it. What came was barely perceptible, a breath with a slight rough edge to it, like a radio frequency that had almost found its station. She sat with it for a long time. At 9:40 that night, she called Frances. The HVAC technician from this morning, she spoke into her text-to-speech interface. The one who serviced the 32nd floor. "I need his full name and the company he works for." Frances was quiet for a moment. "I'll pull the work order." "Tonight, please." The file that arrived at 11 o'clock was brief. Douglas Aaron Reeve, 48, former research engineer, Pacific Northwest Biomedical Institute, 6 years in acoustic laryngeal monitoring and functional voice pathology research, 3 peer-reviewed publications. Left the field 32 months ago following the death of his wife, Patricia Reeve, during a cardiac monitoring failure at St. Clement's Medical Center. Current employment, certified HVAC technician, Cascade Commercial Services. Vivian read the file twice. Then she set the tablet down and looked at the ceiling. Why is he fixing air conditioners? She arranged for a second service call the following Monday. A fabricated complaint about inconsistent airflow on the 28th floor routed through the building's facilities account. Francis placed the request without comment. Douglas knew it wasn't a real job by the time the elevator reached 28. The airflow was consistent. He had worked this building enough to know its patterns. He checked the units anyway, because a job was a job and doing it wrong was not something he was capable of. He was logging the inspection when Francis appeared at the end of the corridor and told him, with the carefully neutral expression of a person carrying out instructions they had decided were none of their concern, that Miss Thorn would like a word. He left his tool bag by the elevator and followed. Vivian was waiting this time, not working. She sat at the conference table, adjacent to her office, hands folded around her tablet, her posture deliberate in the way a person's posture becomes deliberate when they have rehearsed the moment they are about to have. She turned the tablet toward him before he sat down. "You were a researcher." "I was," Douglas said. "You identified something in 7 years that 12 physicians missed." "What did you hear?" Douglas was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, thinking. The specific kind of thinking that happens when a person decides whether the truth they hold is one they are still allowed to give. "Functional dysphonia," he said. "Your vocal cords aren't damaged. The pathway is intact. What's happening is neurological suppression. Your brain has placed a hold on the motor signal to your larynx. It's not a structural problem. It's a protective response to something the brain registered as catastrophic." He paused. "The micro-vocalizations I heard, they don't occur in cases of cord damage. They occur in cases where the cords are present and functional, and the inhibition is coming from higher up. The voice is there. Your brain is simply not allowing it through." Vivian did not move for a long moment. "And what triggered mine?" Douglas looked at her steadily. "I don't know, but you do." The silence that followed had a different quality than the first one. This one had edges. She typed slowly, "I'd like you to leave." He stood, nodded once, and walked to the door. He stopped there without turning around. "The condition has a treatment protocol," he said. "It doesn't require a specialist. It requires saying something out loud, or trying to, that you have never been given space to say." He moved to go. That's where it starts. Then he was in the elevator, and the room behind him, though nothing visible had changed, was a different room than it had been. Vivian Thorn had been 39 years old when her voice stopped. She had been standing at a podium at the Healthcare Innovation Forum in Seattle, about to deliver the closing keynote, when her phone buzzed in her jacket pocket. She had glanced at the screen. The message was from her head of HR, Aldmore Division Restructure, confirmed. 214 affected employees notified this morning. She had approved that restructure 6 weeks earlier. The numbers had been unambiguous. The board had been unanimous. She had signed the authorization without hesitation because that was what the numbers required, and she was, above all else, a person who followed what the numbers required. Standing at the podium, she had opened her mouth, and nothing came out. The specialists who arrived at the diagnosis of functional dysphonia had treated it as a mechanical puzzle, not a human one. They had mapped her larynx. They had measured cord tension. They had tried vibration therapy and breath retraining, and 3 rounds of injections that had done precisely nothing. Not one of them had asked her what she had been about to say when it stopped. Not one of them had asked about the name. His name was Owen Dre. He had worked in the Aldmore division for 11 years. He had been 53 years old, with a mortgage and 2 kids in college. And he had not found another position in the 7 months after the restructure. The report had reached Vivian through a third party, quietly, filed under a category that corporate communications labeled post-separation wellness incident. She had received it, acknowledged it, and placed it in a mental compartment she had not opened since. She had never said his name to anyone, not in the way that mattered, not with the actual weight of the thing attached to it. Bernard Colby had been a fixture in Vivian's professional life since the voice loss began. He had coordinated the specialist referrals, managed the medical advisory board she had assembled, handled the communications and the scheduling and the quiet, ongoing work of ensuring the company ran in spite of the condition rather than being defined by it. He had been, in every observable way, indispensable. Vivian had called this loyalty for 7 years. She had not until 3 nights ago considered whether another word applied. The documentation Francis pulled arrived in 2 folders: 7 years of medical records, specialist reports, treatment summaries, advisory correspondence. Vivian went through them with the same methodical attention she applied to financial audits, and what she found arranged itself, slowly, into a pattern. 2 points in her treatment history where a specialist had documented promising laryngeal response, followed, within 10 days, by a change of therapeutic direction. 1 instance where a recommended research protocol had been tabled by the medical advisory board, after an unscheduled review that Bernard's office had requested. 1 partially redacted email thread with enough remaining to make legible a conversation between Bernard's office and the leadership of a private voice rehabilitation consortium, whose revenue model depended, structurally and completely, on patients who did not get better. She closed the folders and locked them in her desk. The call to Douglas came on a Friday. His supervisor used the word complaint in the flat, careful tone of someone reading from a template written by someone else's attorney. A client had reported unprofessional conduct, overreach of scope, inappropriate engagement with an executive. The language was precise in the way. Language becomes precise when it is designed to cause maximum professional damage while leaving minimum traceable cause. Douglas listened to the full message standing at the kitchen counter. Juniper was at the table behind him, working on the science fair project, which had advanced from a refrigerator list to an actual experiment involving water absorption rates in 3 different soil samples arranged in labeled mason jars. He set the phone down. He stood at the counter for a moment. Then he turned around, sat across from his daughter, and asked how the experiment was going. Juniper told him in detail, with a hand-drawn data chart. He was grateful for the detail. Francis relayed the suspension to Vivian on a Monday morning between the budget review and a board advisory notice. Vivian stopped her at that item. Francis repeated it. Vivian asked who had filed the complaint. Francis said the entity listed on the filing was a third-party compliance management firm that Bernard Colby's office had retained for advisory purposes approximately 2 years prior. Vivian said nothing for a moment. Then, clear my 10 o'clock. Get me the original service log from Cascade Commercial, not through facilities, directly from the company. Bernard appeared at 10:15, unscheduled, which was itself unusual. He carried his concern the way he carried everything, with the polished, tailored assurance of a man who had never had genuine reason to doubt his own indispensability. He sat across from her and spoke with quiet authority about the risks of informal medical engagement, about the importance of proper advisory channels, about the legal exposure that came from accepting counsel from an unlicensed practitioner with no current standing. He used the word protect 4 times. He used her name 3 times. He did not ask how she was feeling. Vivian Thorn listened. She looked at him, not with the practiced professional regard of 7 years, but with the eyes of a person who has just reread a document and understood, on the second reading, what the first had concealed. "Thank you, Bernard," she typed, and turned the screen toward him. I'll take it under advisement. He left satisfied. He should not have been. It was a Thursday when Juniper Reeve discovered that the Thorn Consulting building had an atrium on the second floor, with a living wall of plants and a ventilation current that made the leaves sound almost like wind, and that this was, objectively, among the more interesting things she had encountered in recent memory. Douglas had brought her along for a legitimate scheduled maintenance call, the suspension having been quietly reversed after a letter from Vivian's personal attorney arrived at Cascade Commercial's HR department, citing procedural irregularities in the original complaint filing. Juniper was supposed to wait in the lobby. She had waited in the lobby for approximately 6 minutes before deciding that the lobby had been fully understood and further time there would be unproductive. She found the second-floor atrium. She found the living wall. She found, when she turned from examining a particularly impressive fern, a woman sitting in an armchair near the windows with a tablet in her lap, watching her. Juniper did not produce the particular combination of pity and discomfort that adults often exhibited when they encountered someone who was visibly different or visibly alone. She looked at Vivian Thorn with the direct, open attention of a child who treats every unfamiliar person as someone she has not yet had a conversation with. "Is this your building?" Juniper asked. Vivian typed. She turned the tablet. "Yes. Do you like the wall?" Juniper looked at the ferns. "The sound it makes is good." She came a few steps closer. "Why do you type instead of talk?" Vivian was still for a moment. Then she typed, "My voice doesn't work." Juniper considered this with the serious, unhurried attention she gave to all genuine problems. "Does it hurt?" "No, it just won't come. My dad says sometimes machines won't run because a part inside them is holding still on purpose." She looked at Vivian steadily. "He says the part that's holding still usually has a reason. You have to find the reason before you can fix the part." Vivian looked at the child for a long moment. Douglas found Juniper 45 seconds later, slightly breathless, tool bag abandoned by the elevator. He saw the two of them, his daughter cross-legged on the floor. In front of the armchair, Vivian Thorn's tablet tilted toward her and stopped in the doorway. "I'm sorry," he said, reaching for Juniper's shoulder. "She doesn't stay put." Vivian turned the tablet toward him. "She told me something." She typed the sentence and then beneath it, "The part that's holding still has a reason." Douglas looked at his daughter. Juniper had moved on to examining the fern again. She had said what she had to say and was not waiting for credit. "She took that from a conversation we had about a malfunctioning compressor," Douglas said. "She applies it more broadly than I intended." "She applies it correctly," Vivian typed. She looked at him for a moment. Then her hands moved over the screen again. "I know what Bernard did. I know why. And I'm not ready to stop." Douglas was quiet for a moment. "I'm not practicing." "I know. Come back Wednesday. Francis will send you an address. Bring nothing. Just come." Juniper looked up from the fern. "Can I come?" Vivian looked at the girl. Something moved across her face. Not a smile exactly, but the space where one was beginning to form. "Ask your father." The address Francis sent was a small office suite 2 blocks from the tower, belonging to a retired speech-language pathologist who now used the space for what she described only as occasional consulting. The room had good acoustics, something Douglas noticed immediately and said nothing about, and a wide window that faced east. The first Wednesday, he did not work on her voice at all. He asked about Owen Dre. Vivian gave him single sentences at first, the compressed, efficient biography of a grief that has been filed rather than felt, the restructure, the numbers, the board's unanimous vote, the message on her phone at the podium, and the moment she opened her mouth and discovered that the instrument she had used without thinking for 39 years had simply decided it was finished. Douglas listened without interruption, without the forward lean of someone assembling their response. He received each sentence as it arrived and waited for the next to come on its own. By the end of the hour, she had said Owen Dre's name 4 times. The last time, she said it without prefacing it with context, without apologizing for needing to say it. Just the name, plain and whole, the way a name sounds when you stop treating it as evidence against yourself. Was that the first time? Douglas asked. Vivian was quiet for a long moment, then she typed in the way that counts, yes. The second Wednesday, he guided her through a laryngeal coupling exercise, a method from the functional dysphonia rehabilitation literature designed to re-establish the neural connection between controlled breath and voluntary vocal cord engagement. The principle was that the inhibition in FD was suppressible, not permanent. That rhythmic breathing, paired with the smallest possible intentional sound, could create an opening, not a command, an invitation. 4 counts in, hold, 4 counts out. At the peak of each exhale, the slightest intentional vibration at the back of the throat. 14 minutes in, Vivian Thorn made a sound. It was not a word, not even a syllable. A single sustained tone, barely there, rough-edged, lasting perhaps 2 seconds. But it was entirely under her direction. It came because she intended it to come. Neither of them spoke for a long time afterward. Douglas kept his eyes on the window. Vivian's breathing changed in a way that had nothing to do with the exercise. It was enough. Bernard Colby received the report from his contact at 8:40 on a Thursday evening. He sat in his car in the parking structure and read it twice. The HVAC technician and Vivian Thorn had been meeting at a private location since the preceding week. The sessions were not logged in the official medical advisory calendar. They were not routed through any of the oversight channels Bernard had spent 7 years carefully building and maintaining. He understood what this meant, not with panic, with the cool, calculated clarity of a man who has built his position around someone else's limitation and now feels the foundation beginning to shift. He had not done it with malice in the beginning. He had done it the way most people begin the slow erosion of their own integrity, with a single, justified feeling choice that makes the next one easier. A specialist's report quietly redirected. A treatment protocol suggested for deprioritization pending further review. The consortium arrangement had begun as a consulting fee and had become, over years, something he could not have described cleanly at a dinner party. 7 years, $2.1 million through a private advisory account, every transfer authorization bearing his signature. He called his attorney. He filed an emergency motion requesting an independent executive capacity review. He used the phrase undue influence. He used the phrase vulnerability assessment. He scheduled a board presentation for the following Thursday. Frances saw the calendar notification at 11 that night and photographed it with her personal phone. She sent the image to Vivian at 11:02. The third Wednesday lasted 4 hours. By the end of it, Vivian Thorn could sustain a tone for 8 seconds and had produced, twice, something that approached a vowel. She was not speaking, but the door was no longer sealed. She sat back when they finished and was quiet for a long time. Douglas sat across the room and gave the quiet what it needed, nothing but space. "Tell me about your wife," she said. The words arrived in a whisper, fractured, effortful, imperfect, but real. Douglas looked at the window, then at her. "Patricia," he said, 3 years ago, a cardiac monitoring system failed to flag a rhythm irregularity during a routine procedure. She didn't come out of the OR." He paused. "I had worked on systems like it, not that specific unit, but the same design family. I understood the flaw the moment they told me what happened." He was quiet for a moment. "I've understood it every day since." Vivian's hands moved over her tablet slowly. "You blame yourself for something you didn't build." "I understand how it was built," Douglas said. "That's close enough." She looked at him steadily. Then she set the tablet aside, And when she spoke, it was in that careful, costly whisper that still required everything she had. "You said, the inhibition." She paused, steadying her breath, "comes from protection." Another pause. "Patricia didn't die because you were an engineer." She held his gaze. "She died because sometimes things fail, your knowledge, to keep yourself from using your knowledge." She stopped to breathe. "That's not guilt, that's grief. Wearing a different coat." Douglas was quiet for a very long time. "You explain it better than I do," he said finally. What crossed Vivian Thorn's face was not yet a full smile. But it was the thing that comes before one. When a person remembers what it felt like to have one arrive without being assembled. The board convened at 9 on a Thursday morning in the 32nd floor conference room. Bernard Colby sat near the head of the table, with the settled authority of a man who has arranged the outcome before arriving in the room. He had his motion prepared, his language calibrated, his argument built around the phrase capacity concern in the careful, devastating way that phrase has been used throughout history to silence people who have become inconvenient. He was 3 sentences into his opening remarks when the door opened. What silenced the room was not the entrance. It was the voice. "Good morning." 2 words. Quiet, rough-edged, imperfect in the way things are imperfect when they are real rather than rehearsed, but entirely hers. Vivian Thorn stood in the doorway without a tablet in her hands. She crossed to the head of the table and sat down. She set a leather portfolio on the surface in front of her. She had arrived 40 minutes early. She did not use the tablet for what came next. "I have 3 items," she said, slowly, with the deliberate pace of someone who is choosing every word because every word is costing something and is worth it. And then Bernard can continue. She opened the portfolio. The original medical records came first, pulled directly from the archive, not routed through the Advisory Coordination Office. The versions submitted to the board's Health Oversight Committee over the past 7 years came second. She had marked 3 material discrepancies in red. The third item was a financial disclosure. Frances, standing near the door, connected her laptop to the room's projector. 7 years of transfer records appeared on the screen. A private consortium. An advisory arrangement that had paid Bernard Colby $2.1 million to remain adjacent to a condition that never resolved, because the condition not resolving was the arrangement's entire foundation. Bernard stood. He said her name. He said the word compromised. He said the word manipulated. "I spoke today," Vivian said, and her voice held, imperfectly, entirely without assistance. "For the first time in 7 years, I spoke. In this room, right now." She looked at him across the length of the pale wood table. "You're welcome to tell this board whatever you'd like about what that represents." Bernard did not continue. The board chair, a woman named Florence Greer, who had held her position for 12 years by being the last to speak and the most careful when she did, cleared her throat and asked Bernard to excuse himself pending an independent financial review. She used the word pending in the specific way it is used, when permanence is the actual meaning. Bernard left the room. He left the building an hour later. Douglas was in the corridor when the conference room doors opened. He had not been invited. He had not asked to be. He had dropped Juniper at school at 7:50, watched her run through the gate without looking back. The particular confidence of a child who has never once doubted the person waiting for her at pickup, and then driven across the city and ridden the elevator to 32, and sat down in a chair in the hallway and waited, because it was the available thing, and sometimes the available thing turns out to be exactly the right one. He stood when Vivian Thorn came through the doors. She crossed the corridor toward him without the tablet. Her pace was measured, careful, but each step carried something new in it. Not proof, not performance, just the ordinary, particular weight of a person moving through the world in full possession of themselves. She stopped a few feet from him. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "Bernard is gone," she said. The voice was still rough, still new, still finding its shape. "I heard," Douglas said. "The consortium." She looked at him. The envelope, the position. She took a careful breath. "They need someone who understands why the treatment works. Not just that it works. Someone who can build the protocol that didn't exist when I needed it." She held his gaze. "That's you." He didn't answer right away. He looked at the window at the end of the corridor, where the morning was arriving without announcement. Pale, ordinary, sufficient. "Juniper asked me last night," he said, "whether the broken part is always the part that needs fixing." "What did you tell her?" "I told her sometimes the broken part is fine, and the part that needs fixing is the one that stopped trusting the broken part to be okay." Vivian was quiet. "Open the envelope, Douglas." He almost smiled, not quite close. "Yeah," he said. 3 months later, on a Tuesday morning in early December, Douglas Reeve sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a completed consulting agreement. Pacific Northwest Biomedical Consortium, Research Lead, Functional Voice Disorder Rehabilitation Protocols. Part-time, 2 days a week. The rest of his schedule built around Juniper's school hours, because that was non-negotiable, and everyone involved had understood it immediately. He had filled out the acceptance forms over the course of a week, the way a person does something important, carefully, without rushing, with patience for himself. He was looking at them when his phone buzzed. A voice message, Vivian Thorn's name on the screen. He pressed play. The voice that came through was still imperfect, still working, still finding its full shape, but it was there, present and real and entirely hers. "I gave a presentation this morning, 10 minutes, full board, no tablet. I made it through 8 minutes before I had to pause, a breath. I counted it as a win." He listened to it twice. Then he picked up his pen, signed the agreement on the last page, and placed it in the outgoing mail slot by the door. Juniper came into the kitchen in her socks, sliding the last 2 feet on the hardwood, the way she did every morning, and looked at the papers on the table, with the expression she used when she was determining whether something was significant. "Is that the important thing?" "Yes," he said. She slid into the chair across from him and pulled the orange juice toward her. She looked at him the way she always looked at him when she was deciding something, with the full, unhurried weight of her attention, the way her mother had looked at things that deserved to be seen properly. "Is Miss Vivian coming for dinner this week?" Douglas looked at the signed papers on the table, then at his daughter, then at the winter light coming through the kitchen window, plain and cold and perfectly clear. "I'll ask her," he said. Juniper drank her juice. This settled the matter for her. She moved on to the subject of the science fair, which was in 11 days, and whether the data looked better as a bar graph or a line graph, and whether it was cheating to make the chart pretty when the point was the science. Douglas sat with her in the ordinary Tuesday morning light, in the kitchen of the apartment where everything important had kept happening even when he had stopped believing it could, and felt something he had not felt in a long time. Not happiness, not yet, not entirely, but the accurate beginning of it, the specific sensation of a door that has been held shut from the inside, finally, quietly opened. 7 years of silence is not a mystery. It is a story that needed the right person to listen for the thing. Underneath the thing, the small, honest sound that the official record had never been quiet enough to hear. Douglas Reeve had listened, not because he had a credential or a protocol or anything at all, except the capacity to remain with someone's truth, without flinching and without looking away. He had walked into her building with a tool bag and a work order, and 8 seconds of attention that changed the direction of everything that followed. She had walked out of that conference room speaking. Neither of them had done it alone. That was the part that would still be true long after the December light faded, and the city outside the window kept on being itself, ordinary and ongoing, the way life goes on once it has finally been allowed to.